have Melanie Bottini from California State University Fullerton, a local girl.
Right.
Senior in radio, TV, and film, who's planning to go on a PhD in film and media studies. And her faculty mentor is Rosanne Welch.
So, hi, I'm a film major, so I know this is kind of a history room, but I promise it's related to history. So, my project is titled San Francisco Fury, and my mentor is Dr. Rosanne Welch. So, historical films. So, films about history using real events and real people creating movies. It is actually the oldest feature film genre. The very first feature film was made in Australia in 1906, and it was titled The Story of the Kelly Gang, which is about one of the oldest gangs in the outback in Australia. So, the problem with historical film is that since the very beginning, people always point out historical inaccuracies, like why didn't they get this right? Why couldn't they get the story right? And we as filmmakers know it's a problem. So I actually decided that for my senior honors project here at Cal State Fullerton, I wanted to create a feature-length screenplay about a historical event. So I picked one that means a lot to me, which is the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, because I am from the Bay Area originally. So I wanted to kind of explore that history and see if I could create a historically accurate film. Okay, so for my presentation here, I'm actually going to go over the real stories, what my research revealed, and then I'm going to go over the screenwriting process because I don't know how many people are familiar with it. And so then I'm going to talk about the characters and the narratives that I created based on my research, because I needed to turn this real history into something that audiences would like. So I'm going to talk about what was the solution, and then I'm going to talk about the criticism of historical drama films. So, what happened in 1906? Well, before I can talk about the earthquake, I need to give you some context about San Francisco before 1906. So, it started up in the gold rush, of course. There was these beautiful old buildings. It was just teeming with culture. There was the Barbary Coast, had the casinos and the liveliness of the West, but then there was also, this is the Palace Hotel, and then over there was kind of Market Street. It was a very thriving city. In the center here is the Ghirardelli factory. They were already crunching out the chocolate. There were also some problems in San Francisco before the earthquake. Fire safety was one of them. These buildings were very flammable, and citizens in San Francisco before the earthquake were asking for change. They said, hey, there's a problem here. Fire safety response times were very, like, it was slow. Like, you would end up waiting for several hours before someone could help you, and by that time your house is burned down. Plus, the pipes that carried the water, oftentimes the water pressure was too low and you couldn't put out the fire. So they want to change, and the problem is that the property owners in San Francisco were too cheap to rebuild anything. They owned the politics, they basically owned the mayor himself, and they were like, we're not going to rebuild anything. Unfortunately, they ended up having to anyway, but I'll get to that in a second. Another problem was that they didn't actually know what caused earthquakes at the time. Plate tectonics and that whole thing, that wasn't here yet. So the governor of California actually asked scientists at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, they said, hey, can you find out what happened, like what causes earthquakes? Because we don't understand it. And they basically never finished the report that the governor told them to do. And their assumption was it has something to do with volcanoes. We think that there's like gas trapped under the crust and it's kind of just releasing. They didn't actually know, but the earthquake gave them a little bit of evidence. So, at 5:12 in the morning on April 18th, 1906, there was an earthquake. It lasted for 3 whole minutes, and in the whole several days that the chaos ensued, about 300 people were killed between San Francisco, San Jose, and the East Bay area. So the fire started on the southeastern side of the city, so Market Street, the area we now know as the most thriving financial district. That was where the fire started, and it lasted for 3 whole days. The city was put under martial law because crime rates were very high. Chinatown in particular had a lot of violence, but all over the city there was looting, and people were trying to break into these homes and steal belongings that were abandoned because people were setting up camps in Golden Gate Park to get away from the fire. So looters were shot on site. There were no trials. There was actually a case of a police officer who he saw a man trapped under a collapsed building, and the guy asked him to mercy kill him. And they didn't know what to do because he ended up mercy killing the poor guy. And then they were like, well, we don't really have a legal system right now, so we're not going to put you in jail, but we want to. So everything was a mess. The fire chief actually was killed in the earthquake, so they didn't even have a system. The pipes for the water broke. They had no water, and they ended up stopping the fire 3 days later by exploding all the buildings that were in the way of the fire to try to stop it in its tracks. And it worked, but they also blew up some beautiful homes on Nob Hill. So the very expensive, rich people homes, those were all blown up. Good news is though, so that was 3 days later, they finally put out that earthquake, but Ghirardelli's chocolate factory reopened 10 days later, so they were fine. So after the earthquake, San Francisco was kind of in shambles. Buildings were tilted like that, and I promise, that's not the hill. That is flat street, buildings crooked. Things were burnt down. That is City Hall. The dome was intact. Everything else just crumbled. This is just an example of how flat the city was all of a sudden, which is very different from what it is now. So they had to rebuild the whole city. And this is actually, you can't see it very well, but there's a crack there. Shows how much it moved. There were some places where it actually moved up to 20 feet. So that kind of gave them a clue that the ground was actually moving. It wasn't just gas. So this is a map of San Francisco after the earthquake. This line here depicts what was destroyed by the fire. So I'm going to show you this map in a second and compare it to what I end up using for my screenplay, but I'll go into that in a second. So this is a political cartoon drawn after the earthquake, and it actually depicts kind of what that rebuilding process was like. So each of these men represents one of the industries that helped to rebuild San Francisco, but help is not exactly the right word. They were abusing the city because they had to rebuild, and it's strange because other countries actually contributed more money to the rebuilding of San Francisco. China in particular donated more than $200,000 to the reconstruction of San Francisco, which is in those years was way more money. That's millions of dollars. But these companies were abusing poor San Francisco when it needed help. This is another mural in San Francisco. So during the Great Depression, artists were given money to decorate the city, so they could feed themselves. So this is actually a mural that one artist did, kind of showing how tragic the earthquake was. This woman was crushed under the rubble. You can see the dates right there. And it's kind of just the glowing of the fire and these poor people who lost families, they lost their homes, everyone lost something. This is actually really cool. So we have those old film cameras back in those days. It's really hard to get an aerial picture if flight isn't exactly a thing and you don't have good cameras. A guy figured out a way to put a camera on a kite and release the shutter from the ground. So this is one of the first aerial photos we have of San Francisco, and it's right after the earthquake and the fire's been put out. So that's really cool. So the screenwriting process, I'm going to go into that now because I've kind of given you an overview of the history. So no matter what genre the film is, screenwriters have to research, whether or not it's history. If it's science fiction, they want to be able to use the vocabulary that a scientist would use. Or if you watch cop shows or medical shows, they do their research and they don't want to lie to audiences. We do want to tell real stories. So once you kind of have all that research, the first thing that some screenwriters, not all screenwriters do it in this order necessarily, but for most screenwriters, they want to pick a theme before they even do anything else, because why tell a story if you're not going to tell it for a reason? So for me, I had to read all of this research based on this earthquake and decide what was the lesson that needed to be learned. And San Francisco is a very diverse city, so I had a lot of themes that I needed to convey in my screenplay. So I'm going to go over those when I talk about my characters. So I picked a theme, and then I picked characters. I designed these characters. Who needs to learn that lesson? Who needs to have this story happen to them? And I designed the characters after I created a theme. So this is one way to write a screenplay. This is the Blake Snyder 15 Beats. There are other ways to compose a structure for a screenplay, like Jules Selva, who actually teaches here. She created the 11 steps, but this is my personal favorite. It's really easy for the structure for a screenplay, actually, because all of these things are actually set. You have to have your midpoint on page 45. Your finale should be starting on page 70. There's a very harsh structure, but it's really cool because one page on a screenplay is 1 minute of screen time unless otherwise stated. If there's an action scene, it may say they fight for 5 minutes, and I don't want to explain it all. But this is really cool. The structure for screenplays are actually very simple. So once you have a structure, you write it, and then you rewrite it, and you rewrite it, and sometimes you'll have like 20 drafts of a screenplay because you take scenes out, you put new ones in, you hate the dialogue, you love the dialogue. Everything can change, and sometimes it changes after you're done with the screenplay, and the director will like say, you know what, that actor is just not right saying that line, and they'll change it on the set. Sometimes during editing, lines are deleted. So when you write a screenplay, it is never the same when it hits the screen. So there's kind of a struggle there because you want to make a scene and you want to make the story so solid that a director won't want to change it, but it is hard because even as a screenwriter, you're going to want to change things. So I made 4 families to learn these lessons that I felt were most important for the story of San Francisco. The first one is the Parker family. So they are this wealthy family. They live on Nob Hill. They are kind of struggling with, they're not getting along. Their marriage is crumbling. She's kind of caught up in the Barbary Coast, kind of gambling and party life, and he was born into money, so he doesn't approve of that. In the earthquake, their son is injured and they need to find medical help, so they have to go to Golden Gate Park and find a doctor, but there's also no water, so they can't clean the wound, everything's a mess. So the Smith family, they live over on California Street, kind of in the smaller, quieter side of the city. Christopher is recruited by the military to help put out the fire because that actually happened. Like a lot of men were taken away from their families and said, hey, you're able-bodied, come put out this fire for us. So he leaves his wife and 4 kids at Golden Gate Park and goes to help out with the relief. Chinatown, I said, had a lot of violence, and a lot of children were actually orphaned because parents were killed or they just abandoned them, and then immigration was a big issue back then. So I created Luli, who goes by Lily Zhao. She's a 2nd-generation immigrant, and she has to experience everything that my research revealed about Chinatown, like, and what happened during the earthquake, because they did burn down. So that is Lily. So then this is actually the reason I wrote my screenplay. This is the reason right here. My ancestors were there, and this is a picture of them, but this is the characters I created. So Domenico, Luisa, Assunta, and Anthony De Vincenzi. They had only been in the city for a year. They didn't know English, they had nothing, and they were terrified because it was like, well, do we move back now? We just lost what little we had, and we don't even speak the language, so we can't ask for help. So this is the reason why I wrote it, but I kind of changed around my story. Like, I heard it from my Nana, and I wanted to respect them, but I feel like I had to make it into the Hollywood form or else it wouldn't be a good screenplay. So it's very difficult to find that balance between respecting your history and then making it interesting, honestly. So this is that map I showed you guys about what was burnt down in the fire. So these 4 stars, that one's a little hard to see, these are where I placed the characters' homes. So this is the Smith family, this is the Parkers, this is Nob Hill area, that is Chinatown, like this chunk right here, and then right here, there was actually a little island that wasn't burnt down. That's where my ancestors happened to be living, luckily, but kind of scary when all your neighbors' houses are burnt down. So we've seen this after a lot of movies. So it basically says, so we made this up. If we happen to get it right, we're really sorry, and we don't owe you any money. That's why it's there. But why is it there, though? When you watch a historical film and you see that, you're saying, well, wait a second. Like, I want you to have things intentionally correct. Like, why doesn't it accurately show the history? So we like historical drama films. They're popular. It's a very prominent genre. Every year we have 1 or 2 come out and we just say, man, I'm really glad I get to see this. And then you watch it and you're like, what? That wasn't right. No, that's not what the news article said. That's not what the book said. Why? So #1 restriction of accuracy of history in film is budget. That's simple as that. It's sometimes really hard to get your hands on period clothing. Sometimes they don't have the time and money to go to academics and ask them, hey, how did the people talk back then? Or what was culture really like? Sometimes all they have is a little bit of research and reading and stuff, but they don't have the time and money to put into talking to historians. And I think that was the #1 thing I discovered from my research, was that if I wanted to make it 100% accurate, I needed to be writing with a historian who was an expert. And oftentimes, like, oftentimes it's just really hard. And I mean, History Channel, that's one thing. But Hollywood, they don't really want to. They would rather put their money on explosions. I mean, come on, that's what they all do. So, does anyone know what these films all have in common? No? Okay, I'll just tell you. So, they are all Academy Award-winning films. So whether or not they're historically respected, they are really good films because the filmmakers may not be good at history, but they're good at making films. So, if we want films to be historically accurate, we need to push for a collaboration between historians and filmmakers because obviously they know what they're doing, but it's that communication that's necessary to make good, historically accurate films. So, thank you for listening to my presentation.
Anybody have any questions?
Hi.
Hi. I was wondering about the last point you just kind of said. What ideas would you offer to kind of have more of a collaboration between screenwriters and historians?
Well, honestly, I think more of the effort needs to be put on the part of the filmmakers because I believe that historians, if approached more, would gladly give the information. I think the problem is that a lot of filmmakers, we kind of, I mean, I say I because I'm part of that community, I think, but we kind of get caught up in the, oh yeah, it would be really cool if this happened, and then there's an explosion, and then they're crying, and it's like this long, dramatic scene, and they don't really think about the, well, would this really happen? Because they'd rather think through a story, play it out in their head, and they just think, okay, like, that's enough. And I think the that's enough mentality in Hollywood kind of needs to stop if we want it to be historically accurate,
Right.
Because the problem is, like, they don't see it as, it's not a historical text to them it's artwork, and the problem is the audiences see it as historical text sometimes, and it's like, no, it's art. Unless they say, we want you to learn a lesson here, we want you to actually learn all the history, like, it's like, there's communication everywhere, I think is the problem, between audience members, the filmmakers, and the historians. So.
Isn't it unreasonable for someone like me to expect you to want to make a historical film that's 100% historically inaccurate? And isn't it naive of you to think that you could do so if budget and you're going to succumb to the Hollywood formula? And naive of someone like me to think that I'm going to go and be shown something that's inclusive of everything and 100%
Yes.
inaccurate?
So,
Maybe this genre doesn't have to live up to that high bar.
Yeah, well, because I actually, unrelated to this particular project, I actually did a research project in which I kind of looked at, like, historians who wrote papers about how mad they were, like, this film was not right, and I think the problem was that filmmakers, I mean, they know they're going to be disappointing some people, but most of them are kind of, they're performing to an average person, I think, average being, like, general, because we don't want to assume our audience is stupid, but we also can't assume our audience knows everything, and I think that's one problem. And then I think for historians, it's like, as a filmmaker, like, I want to be 100% accurate because I hate lying to my audience, but then I've also written, like, a science fiction film, and for that, it's like, I don't know anything about quantum physics, but I'm going to BS my way around this topic about, like, I had a space travel and they go through a black hole, and I'm not going to be able to get it right, and I feel bad. I wish there was a disclaimer at the end of films instead of saying, like, it's an unintentional coincidence. Like, I wish I could say, like, we're really sorry, we probably got a lot wrong, but we hope that you're at least happy with the story you just watched. I think story over information, that's how it should be for film, but I don't know. It's a really hard compromise. It's really hard.
In your research, what do you think are some of the most historically accurate films?
I think, has anyone seen the film Gandhi? Yeah. I think Gandhi, the thing about Gandhi is it's a really good film, and I believe it got, yeah, Gandhi, it got 8 Academy Awards. So for Gandhi, like, the problem with it is, as a film though, it is rather long and dragging, but that's how you kind of know that a historical drama movie is being accurate, is when it starts to drag out a little bit. Because it's becoming more of a history book, and it's kind of obvious. But then you watch Titanic, for example, which got 11 Academy Awards, and he made it up. He made it up, and because he knew that he could tell you a story, and he could tell you a love story that would make you cry, and he wasn't sure that he could take some real story and not tweak it too much to disrespect these real people, but like it's really hard. You don't want to mess around with someone's name and their actual history because you're going to offend a family member, you're going to offend someone. It's sometimes really safer to stick to making up a story and making it super Hollywood, but the more Hollywood it is, the less realistic it is. But I think Gandhi is really strong. I personally like Lawrence of Arabia, and I don't believe it's necessarily accurate, but it's also very respected, like old historical film, so yeah.
Oh, yeah, just a quick question about your characters. I noticed that you tried to have some of the variance in like class and things. I thought it was really great. But I know we don't actually get to see what you end up doing with those characters, but kind of why did you decide to make it so that it's so varying?
Yeah, so, well, for one thing, I actually have my book, but I can't show it to you because it's under a camera right now. But, so my book, it's written by a guy who was living in the city at the time, and he literally just collected firsthand experiences. And he actually spoke a lot about Chinatown in particular, and he said that it's very horrible. He compares the people living in Chinatown to rats, and he says that they came out from the streets, and he's very racist, but he's a product of his time. But he said that there was a high volume of Chinese people, so I thought, okay, they have to be represented. There was a section of town that had Italian, Portuguese, the Spanish people were living there at the time. So there's like a mix of cultures out there, and so I figured my ancestors fit into that section of town. I kind of like wanted to take a cross-section of the city and kind of make sure each was kind of represented visually, but we do know like there was a high volume of white people. There was a lot of rich white people living in the city, and I figured there are a lot of secondary characters that aren't talked about. A lot of them are white, and I figured the best way to go about it was to make sure that the people in the spotlight were accurately showing the diversity of the city, but that I have a lot of real people from the event. So I have Mr. Ghirardelli. He makes an appearance in this like one scene, little funny joke about chocolate being made later. But his brother actually died, really sad. Yeah, the second oldest son of the Ghirardelli family, he passed away from shock. But like Mr. Ghirardelli shows up, the general of El Presidio military base shows up. So like tried to have a lot of different people come up, but I didn't want to disrespect anyone, so that's kind of, I hope that answered your question, but.
I have a cool question about like in terms of like your like when do you start the story? At what point? Is it in the midst of it? Like what was your approach in deciding that?
Keep going backwards in my slideshow. Okay, so the opening image right here. So it's really hard when you want to start a film like with the earthquake, because it's like, well, I need to make sure that people want to sympathize with this character before I like kill the mother. I kill Lily's mom like almost instantly. So it's tricky. I have an opening image of the city, like you pan in on it, and that's obviously the first page, but I left 10 pages to introduce you to the characters. On page 13 is when the earthquake happens, and it only lasts for a page, and it's like, it's the way you do a montage is you can have like bullet points of images. So for me, I have image of the Zhao family, their house catches on fire, the oil lamp falls off the table, image, and so the end of Act 2 falls around page 40, and by the end of page 40, they've said, okay, there's an earthquake, we need to go to the camp at Golden Gate Park. The fire's put out at the beginning of Act 3 because for me, the finale and the big buildup was these families watching as everything they had just be gone and the dust is settling. So for me, my third act is actually kind of like unsettlingly calm. So that's how I structured my story.